Kanao Inouye is one of only two Canadians ever to face prosecution for war crimes. In his role as an interpreter for the Japanese Army during World War II, he tortured Canadian prisoners of war, but it was high treason, not war crimes, that saw him march to the gallows. Inouye is also believed to be the last Canadian to meet his end this way. Now, this strange, little-known chapter of our military history is being told in a new book. Here to talk about Traitor By Default, the Trials of Kanao Inouye, the Kamloops Kid, is author Patrick Brode. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Uh, First off, what drew you to this story, Patrick? What made you write this book?
I first came across it in the 1990s when I wrote a book about Canada's war crimes prosecutions at the end of the Second World War. And this was one of them. And I gave a brief account of it, but I became more interested in it as time went by. And I decided to revisit it and look at some of it because it seemed to be some of it was off, was not correct. And I thought I should try and give the real story of what actually happened.
Now, what is Inouye's origin story? He's born in Kamloops, hence his nickname. His father worked in lumbering. Unlike his sisters, he was given a distinctly Japanese first name. Do you think the expectation, even back then, is that he would return to Japan one day?
Yes, I think so. I think his mother had ambitions for him of going into the export-import business, and that he would be a go-between between Japan and North America and make a good living. Indeed, his father, after the First World War, got into selling products in Japan, so it was not an unrealistic expectation.
Now, Kanao's father took the family back to Japan for a visit in 1926, then suddenly dies of appendicitis, making Kanao the Koshu, or head of the family. Becomes his grandfather's ward in 1935, but finds Japanese society doesn't accept him because he's a Nisei, a foreign-born Japanese. So how does he end up becoming an interpreter?
Well, according to his first story, there were several, but according to his first story, he was living in Tokyo in 1942, and the military called him up as a civilian to assist them because they needed English speakers to assist them in communicating with this large number of prisoners they now held. So he was sent down to Tokyo and arrived there in September of 1942. And then all of a sudden, after several years of living in Japan, was cast in the midst of 1,700 Canadian POWs.
Now, he was nicknamed the Kamloops Kid and Slap Happy Joe by his prisoners. Where did his anger come from?
I think it's pretty apparent that he held a lot of animosity against the Canadians that he'd grown up with, the white Canadians that he'd lived with in Vancouver as he came of age. And there were several stories, and none of them were really contradicted, that he felt that he had been slighted and ignored, and now was the time for payback. All of a sudden, he was on top, and all of these white Canadians were on the bottom, and now it was payback time. And he was going to get it by especially being brutal to Canadians, beating them whenever he had a chance. So that's really beyond dispute. That's the way he felt about things.
As you write, or someone is quoted in the book, he was a monster driven mad somehow, somewhere, mad with all things white and Canadian. His craving for vengeance was awesome. Very powerful stuff.
Pretty gothic too. That's the way one Canadian who was had a very florid sense of expression described him. I don't necessarily attribute that, go along with that myself, but he didn't seem to like Canadians. On the other hand, one also mentioned the fact that he was talking with a group of Canadians once and was talking about going back to Canada when the war was over. So he was a little bit with a foot in both shores. He really was he did seem to have some ambitions for some time of going back there. After all, spent about his first 20 years growing up in British Columbia.
Now, Kanao returns to Hong Kong as a police interpreter for the Kempe Tai. I hope I'm saying that right. The Hong Kong branch was reorganized in 1945. He was not hired back. But then about 369 Canadians were liberated from Sham Shui Po. the POW camp. All prisoners returned from Asia were debriefed. What's interesting to me here is that more than 1,000 depositions were received, and of these, more than 200 make specific references to the Kamloops Kid. Why wasn't he transferred back to Canada to be tried for his crimes here?
Well, for starters, he's under British custody in Hong Kong. Now, Canadians are obviously quite interested in getting this guy because it's been all over the newspapers how awful he was, and we should put him on trial. And it becomes really something of an international political football as to what are we going to do with this guy? If we brought him to Canada, what would he be charged with? We're not really terribly sure. Could he be a war criminal in Canada? And once again, if we brought him back to Canada, it would be brought out in his defense how Japanese Canadians were treated during the war and the fact that they were not treated as Canadian citizens. So the government really wasn't anxious to raise all those issues, and it really got kicked back and forth. And it finally went to the cabinet, and the cabinet in Ottawa said, look, the British have him, and they know what they're doing. Just leave things alone. So Canada just couldn't make up its mind what to do with him. The British did. The war was over, they had won, and people had to stand trial for what they did. And they had no hesitation about putting Kanao Inouye on trial for war crimes.
Now, he ends up pleading not guilty. What was his defense? Was it a version of just following orders?
It was that, and he presented a very odd defense about, well, these things really didn't happen, you know. I really don't have anything against Canadians or people in general. And all these accounts of my torturing people, which were confirmed by a variety of witnesses, it seemed to be beyond question. Well, those things really didn't happen. I was just an interpreter. I was just a machine that interpreted from English into Japanese. That's all I did. So why blame me? I didn't do anything. Not a very credible defense, really, at the end of the day.
And after this lengthy trial, the whole thing is ruled invalid because it's established that he's a Canadian and at the time a British subject, so he fell outside the jurisdiction of a war crimes trial. So then he's accused of high treason, and then he changes his story again to show his fealty to the Japanese Empire. So what happens there?
Well, that he does a 180-degree turn completely and says, well, I'm really a Japanese. I love Japan. I served in the Japanese army, as a matter of fact, which he did for 2 years. He said, I love the emperor and I will do whatever the emperor commands of me. I have no apologies to make. I tortured people because they were the enemies of my country. I did as I was commanded to do, and I would do it again tomorrow. At one point during his treason trial, he snaps to attention and says, just calls out as loud as he can, "Banzai, long live the emperor." And the trial judge says, well, calm down. We don't need the theatrics. But we kind of did need the theatrics. His defense now was, look, I'm Japanese. I can't be a traitor because my loyalty is to Japan, not to Britain or to Canada. Seemed to be a credible defense on the face of it.
Now, the name Kanao Inouye shows up on lists of the top 10 worst Canadians ever, notorious personages in history. What do you think the legacy of the Kamloops Kid is?
I'm not terribly sure. He did some very awful things. He was a sadistic man who thought that there would be no consequences. He could do these things to innocent people who fell under his control, and there would be no consequences. So he did brutal things. He beat people, he tortured them, and he deserved to be harshly punished for that. No question about it. There was no evidence, by the way, though, that he ever actually killed anybody. At his first trial, he was accused of 4 murders. And even on that matter, the court concluded there was no evidence that he murdered anybody. So without having actually killed anybody, it seemed a stretch to hold him accountable for a capital offense. Many other Japanese guards, for example, who clearly had killed many prisoners, got jail terms. but not him. He was executed. So his legacy, I don't know. He deserved to be punished, and I guess it's a measure of the hysteria after the war that he got a trial and a punishment that didn't really fit the crime. Although he should have been punished, no question about it. Was it a fair or appropriate trial? I really have my doubts.
Were any particular legal precedents set here?
Well, yes, there were a couple at least. One was the issue of his citizenship. He claimed that he was a Japanese, that he had been registered since his birth as a Japanese citizen. He traveled under a Japanese passport. He served in the Japanese military. Even Canada's senior officer in Asia said, this guy has done everything possible to show that he is actually a Japanese citizen. He agreed with him. And he had a number of documents in Tokyo that proved all this. The trial judge in Hong Kong refused to allow any adjournment to look at those documents. They were on their way, and he said, I don't care. You were born in British territory, and that's all I need to know. Put the blinkers on. I don't want to hear any further information. So they convicted him and said, by the way, you're a traitor, just because you happen to be born in Kamloops. 2 weeks after the end of his trial, and it really stunned me when I looked at it, because I looked at the notifications of when these documents were received. 2 weeks after the end of his trial, all the documents came in from Tokyo saying, by the way, this guy is Japanese. He's done everything possible to conform to Japanese law and citizenship. So it's the question of dual nationality. Is it possible that he was a citizen of both countries? And if he was British and Japanese, when those two countries went to war, who do you owe your loyalty to? Still a bit of a question mark, and more so these days because so many people across the world have dual citizenships. I could have, and at one point I was both a Canadian and American citizen. It's not uncommon. The other issue that came out of the trial was the fact of the trial judge's conduct of it. I think it was pretty clear that the trial judge wanted to get this guy. He'd heard some damning testimony about him torturing, and at one point torturing a woman. And that really offended the trial judge's sensibilities, questionable. And he told the jury, well, the guy is a Japanese citizen. I'm sorry, he is a Canadian citizen, without any doubt. And that was a question of fact that only the jury could have decided. The jury was obviously on the fence about that question. But the trial judge said, don't worry about it. He is a British subject. And once you're a British subject, acting for the Japanese the way he did, you're a traitor. And the only punishment for that is execution. So, once again, it was not a very neat trial. It was a situation where the judge seemed to be predetermined to get a result. And by George, he got it.
A traitor by default, if you will.
Yes. Well, we have to hang somebody. A lot of terrible things happened. And I get they had him at hand, so he's it.
What do you hope folks get out of the book?
Well, perhaps a great understanding of some of the difficulties in determining citizenship and loyalty. Just because you're born in one country might mean, though, that ethnically or by culture, you're really more drawn to another country and you want to serve it. It could happen. And we really can't judge those differences. I mean, it's still a problem determining which country you actually owe your loyalty to.
The name of the book is Traitor by Default, The Trials of Kanao Inouye, the Kamloops Kid. It's published by Dundurn Press. My thanks to author Patrick Brode.
Thank you. Appreciate it.